Gloucestershire, England, spring 1816. The first warm afternoon of the season filtered through the tall windows of Thornley Court's east drawing room, casting golden rectangles across Persian carpets worn soft by generations of footsteps. Constance Millicent Davenport stood before those windows, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles stood out starkly beneath her kid gloves, and wondered with a peculiar detachment whether this was how condemned prisoners felt in their final moments before the sentence was carried out. At 22, she had imagined her wedding day quite differently. There would be orange blossoms and lace, beloved faces gathered in the family chapel, a groom who looked at her with something warmer than the cool assessment she had received from Lucian Bellamy, Viscount Thornley, when they had been introduced precisely 4 days prior. Instead, she wore a simple ivory gown hastily altered by her lady's maid, carried no flowers, and had walked alone down the aisle of a chapel that smelled of dust and abandonment, while her brother Edmund stood rigid as stone in the front pew, his expression one of barely concealed relief. The marriage was concluded in precisely 11 minutes. The Viscount's voice had been steady and utterly devoid of emotion as he spoke his vows. Her own had trembled only once. If stories of love that defy society's cruelest judgments move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. Now, mere hours after the ceremony, Constance waited in the drawing room as instructed, while her new husband attended to estate business with his steward. A maid had shown her to this room with a curtsy and a murmured instruction to make herself comfortable, though comfort seemed a laughable concept in a house this vast and cold. Thornley Court sprawled across the Gloucestershire countryside like a stern, unyielding sentinel, all grey stone and countless windows that reflected the sky without warmth. The gardens she had glimpsed from the carriage appeared neglected, overgrown in places, as though the house itself had been mourning something for far too long. The door opened without warning. Constance turned, her heart quickening despite her best efforts at composure, as the Viscount entered. He moved with the unconscious grace of a man utterly secure in his position and power, tall and lean in his dark coat and precisely tied cravat. His features were handsome in a severe way, all strong angles and sharp lines, with grey eyes that seemed to look through rather than at a person. Those eyes settled on her now, with the same cool appraisal he might give a new horse in his stables. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, and the name sounded foreign and wrong in her ears. "I trust the room is satisfactory." "Perfectly, my lord," Constance replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She had learned long ago, during the slow descent of her family into debt and disgrace, how to maintain dignity when everything inside her wanted to crumble. He crossed to the sideboard and poured himself a measure of brandy without offering her anything. The gesture, small as it was, spoke volumes about how this marriage would proceed. "I believe it best we establish certain understandings immediately," he said, not looking at her as he spoke. "This union serves a practical purpose for both our families. You require financial security and restoration of your family's standing. I require a competent mistress for my household and, in time, an heir." Each word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of cold reality through Constance's remaining hopes. She had known, of course, that this was a business arrangement. Edmund had made that brutally clear when he informed her that the Viscount had agreed to pay their father's astronomical gambling debts in exchange for her hand. But hearing it stated so baldly, with such complete absence of even polite pretense, cut deeper than she had anticipated. She inclined her head, a gesture of quiet defeat. "I understand, my lord," she said quietly. "Do you?" He turned then, those grey eyes fixing on her with unsettling intensity. "I wonder. You are young, Miss Davenport. Mrs. Bellamy, I should say. Young women often harbour romantic notions despite the realities of their circumstances." Heat crept up Constance's neck, a flush of humiliation and anger that she fought to control. "I assure you, my lord, that I harbour no illusions about the nature of our arrangement. My brother made the terms quite clear." "Good." He took a swallow of his brandy. "Then understand this as well. You will have your own apartments in the East Wing. Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper, will show you to them shortly. You will manage the household as you see fit, entertain when necessary, and fulfill all the social obligations expected of a viscountess. In return, you will have access to funds for your personal needs, a generous clothing allowance, and the freedom to pursue whatever interests occupy your time." "That is most generous," Constance managed, though the words tasted like ash. "It is practical," he corrected. "You will dine in your rooms unless we are entertaining. I prefer to take my meals in solitude. We will attend church together on Sundays and present a united front in society when required. Beyond that, our lives will remain largely separate." Constance felt something inside her begin to fracture, some small remaining piece of hope she had not even been aware she still possessed. She had prepared herself for a loveless marriage, but this absolute isolation, this reduction of their union to mere transaction, was crueler than she had imagined. "I see. And when you require an heir, my lord?" Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to identify. "That is a matter for the future. There is no immediate urgency." "Of course." She dropped her gaze to her hands, still clasped tightly before her. The wedding ring on her finger felt heavy as iron. "One more thing, Mrs. Bellamy." His voice had gained a certain severity she could not quite interpret. "I want you to understand completely. This is purely business. You will manage my household, provide an heir when the time comes, fulfill social obligations as required. But understand this and understand it well." He paused, and Constance forced herself to meet his eyes again. "You will never be my true wife." The words hung in the air between them, brutal in their clarity. Constance felt the blow as though struck, the breath leaving her lungs in a rush. She saw in his face that he meant every word, that there was no room for negotiation or hope of change. Whatever had made this man so cold, so utterly closed to even the possibility of warmth, was beyond her ability to understand or heal. "I understand perfectly, my lord," she heard herself say, her voice coming from somewhere distant and detached. "You have been most clear." "Excellent." He set down his glass with a decisive clink. "Mrs. Henshaw is waiting in the hall. She will show you to your rooms and familiarize you with the household. I will be dining at my club in the village this evening and will likely return late. You need not wait up." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. For a moment, Constance fleetingly thought he might relent, might soften the cruelty of his earlier declaration. But he simply gave her a brief nod and left, closing the door quietly behind him. Constance stood alone in the drawing room as the afternoon light began to fade, listening to his footsteps retreat down the corridor. She did not cry, though her eyes burned with the effort of holding back tears. Instead, she sought the window, her gaze fixing on the wilderness of roses and weeds that stretched toward the distant tree line. She had survived her father's descent into madness and debt. She had survived watching her beloved mother's health fail from worry and shame. She had survived Edmund's cold practicality in selling her to the highest bidder to save what remained of the family name. She would survive this too. But as the sun set over Thornley Court, painting the neglected gardens in shades of gold and amber, Constance made herself a silent promise. She would be the perfect Viscountess, managing his household with flawless efficiency, maintaining his social standing without complaint. She would fulfill every obligation expected of her position. But she would protect what remained of her heart, would build walls as high and cold as his own, and she would never ever allow herself to hope for more than he had promised to give, becoming the perfect facade of a Viscountess. The housekeeper's discreet knock came a few minutes later. Constance turned from the window, straightened her spine, and prepared to begin her new life. Mrs. Henshaw proved to be a woman of perhaps 50 years, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a manner that suggested years of managing difficult situations with quiet competence. She led Constance through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past closed doors and shrouded furniture, up a grand staircase worn smooth by centuries of use. "The east wing has been prepared for your ladyship," Mrs. Henshaw said as they climbed. The apartments were the late Viscountess's, his lordship's mother, Lady Beatrice. They have been closed these 22 years, but we have aired them thoroughly and replaced what was necessary. 22 years? Constance could not help her surprise. Has the Viscount lived alone all that time? Something passed over the housekeeper's face, a flicker of old sorrow. "His lordship prefers solitude, my lady." She was a gentle soul, much beloved by the staff. They reached the top of the stairs and turned left into a corridor lined with portraits. Constance glimpsed faces from across the centuries, Bellamy ancestors in ruffs and velvets, stern men and elegant women who had lived and loved and died within these walls. She wondered if any of them had been as lonely as she felt in this moment. The apartments Mrs. Henshaw showed her were unexpectedly beautiful. A sitting room decorated in shades of blue and cream faced south, filled even now with the last light of day. Beyond it, a bedchamber with an ornate four-poster bed and delicate furnishings that spoke of feminine taste. A dressing room, a private study, even a small conservatory with walls comprised entirely of glass that looked out over the gardens. "It is lovely," Constance said honestly, trailing her fingers over a writing desk inlaid with mother of pearl. Lady Beatrice had exquisite taste. "She did indeed, my lady." Mrs. Henshaw opened the wardrobe to show where Constance's meagre collection of gowns had already been hung. She was very fond of the gardens, particularly the roses. Created quite a showplace before her illness took her. Constance moved to the window, drawn by something she could not name. From this vantage point, she could see more of the grounds, including what appeared to be a walled garden in the distance, overgrown and wild, but still discernible in its original structure. "The rose garden?" "Aye, my lady. Locked up after her death by the late Viscount, his lordship's father. Never opened it again, and the current Viscount has kept it closed as well. A shame, truly. It was magnificent in its day." "Why would they close it?" The question escaped before Constance could stop it. Mrs. Henshaw's expression shuttered slightly. "The old Viscount was a hard man, my lady. Grew harder after Lady Beatrice passed. I should not speak of it." "Of course." Constance turned from the window, recognizing the boundary she had inadvertently crossed. "Forgive me. It has been a rather overwhelming day." The housekeeper's face softened. "I imagine so, my lady. Shall I have a tray sent up? You must be famished, and his lordship mentioned you would take your meals here." "That would be kind, thank you." Constance managed a smile she did not feel. "And Mrs. Henshaw? I hope you will help me learn the running of the household. I wish to fulfill my duties properly." "Of course, my lady. We will begin tomorrow, if that suits. For tonight, rest and recover yourself." Mrs. Henshaw moved toward the door, then paused. "If I may say so, my lady, it does my heart good to see these rooms lived in again." Lady Beatrice would have been pleased. After the housekeeper left, Constance sank into a chair by the window and finally allowed herself the luxury of tears. They came silently, tracking down her cheeks as she watched darkness claim the gardens below. She cried for the life she had lost, for the mother who had died believing her daughter would find happiness, for the future that stretched before her like an endless winter. But she did not cry for long. Constance had learned that tears changed nothing, that survival required strength rather than sorrow. She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and began to unpack the few personal items she had brought from her family home. A miniature of her mother, a book of poetry given to her on her 16th birthday, a pressed flower from the gardens where she had played as a child. She placed them carefully around the room, small anchors of who she had been before she became the Viscount's purchased bride. Then she sat at the writing desk and composed a brief note to Edmund, informing him that she had arrived safely and the marriage was complete. She did not mention her husband's coldness or her own despair. Edmund would not care, and she would not give him the satisfaction of knowing how thoroughly he had destroyed her chance at happiness. The tray arrived as promised, bearing a surprisingly generous supper. Constance discovered she was hungry despite everything, and she ate while reviewing the mental list of tasks that awaited her. She would need to learn the household routines, meet the staff properly, understand the social expectations of a viscountess in this county. She would transform herself into exactly what the Viscount required, an efficient, unobtrusive manager of his domestic affairs. And she would lock away every dream she had ever harbored about love, companionship, and the gentle intimacies of marriage. Those things were not for her. This was her life now, purchased with her family's debts and sealed with vows spoken in an empty chapel. As she prepared for bed that first night in Thornley Court, Constance made one final vow to herself. She would survive this. She would even perhaps find ways to be content within the narrow confines of her new existence. But she would never again be foolish enough to hope for more than what had been promised. The Viscount had made his position clear. She would never be his true wife. Very well. Then she would be the perfect facsimile of one, flawless in execution and utterly untouchable in her heart. The morning brought rain, a steady drumming against the windows that matched Constance's grey mood. She rose early, dressed with care in a morning gown of pale green muslin, and presented herself to Mrs. Henshaw in the housekeeper's sitting room precisely at 8 o'clock. "Punctual, my lady," Mrs. Henshaw observed with approval. "That bodes well. Shall we begin with a tour of the house proper?" The next several hours passed in a blur of rooms and corridors, names and duties. Thornley Court was even larger than Constance had realized, with dozens of bedchambers, multiple drawing rooms, a grand ballroom that had not been used in years, and countless other spaces in various states of maintenance. The staff numbered 23, from the ancient butler Greaves to the youngest scullery maid. "His lordship entertains rarely," Mrs. Henshaw explained as they walked through the state dining room, its table capable of seating 40 beneath a chandelier shrouded in holland cloth. "But when he does, standards must be impeccable." "Of course." Constance ran her hand along the table's edge, feeling dust beneath her glove. "When was the last time this room was used?" 7 years ago, my lady." "For his lordship's betrothal celebration." Constance stopped walking. "His betrothal?" Mrs. Henshaw's face took on that same shuttered expression Constance had seen the previous evening. "I beg your pardon, my lady. I assumed you knew. His lordship was engaged to Miss Rosalind Fairchild, daughter of the Earl of Westbrook. She passed away of typhoid fever 3 weeks before the wedding. His lordship has not entertained formally since." The revelation struck Constance with unexpected force. 7 years. He had loved someone enough to marry her, and she had died just weeks before they were to be wed. No wonder he was so cold, so determined to keep his new wife at arm's length. He was protecting himself from the possibility of caring and losing again. "How terrible," Constance murmured. "For both of them." "Indeed, my lady. Miss Fairchild was a lovely young woman by all accounts. Her death devastated his lordship." Mrs. Henshaw moved toward the door, clearly ready to change the subject. "Shall we continue?" She learned about household accounts, menu planning, the care of linens and silver, all the minutiae of running a great house. But part of her remained fixed on the image of a younger Viscount, grief-stricken and alone, closing himself off from the world. It explained much, though it did not excuse his cruelty to her. She had done nothing to deserve his coldness beyond the misfortune of being sold to him by her desperate brother. But understanding his wounds at least provided context for his behavior. She did not see the Viscount at all that first full day. He kept to his own wing of the house, riding out in the morning despite the rain, and remaining in his study for the afternoon. Constance dined alone in her sitting room, read for an hour by the fire, and retired early, exhausted by the emotional toll of the past 2 days. The pattern repeated itself over the following week. Constance rose, met with Mrs. Henshaw, learned more about the management of Thornley Court, and occupied herself with quiet pursuits in her apartments. She saw her husband only at Sunday service in the village church, where they sat together in the Bellamy family pew and presented a picture of respectable matrimony that fooled no one with eyes to see. On the 8th day, restless and weary of her own company, Constance decided to explore the grounds. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the gardens sparkling under a tentative sun. She donned a pelisse and bonnet and ventured out through the terrace doors, grateful to be outside after days of confinement. The formal gardens near the house showed signs of basic maintenance, but lacked the care that would make them truly beautiful. Constance walked along gravel paths lined with boxwood hedges in need of trimming, past beds where last year's growth had not been properly cleared. Her fingers itched to begin setting things right, but she held back. She did not yet know the boundaries of her authority here. It was the walled garden that drew her, that mysterious locked space she had glimpsed from her window. She found the entrance easily enough, an arched wooden door set into a brick wall thick with ivy. The door was locked as Mrs. Henshaw had indicated, but Constance peered through a gap where the wood had warped with age and caught her breath at what she saw. Even in its abandoned state, even choked with weeds and wildness, the beauty of Lady Beatrice's rose garden was evident. Stone paths wound between beds where roses of every colour had once bloomed. A fountain stood at the centre, dry and covered in moss but still graceful in its proportions. Arbours and trellises collapsed under the weight of untamed vines, and everywhere the ghosts of careful planning and loving cultivation remained visible beneath the decay. "It is magnificent," Constance whispered to herself. Or it was. It could be again. "My lady." A voice behind her made Constance jump. She turned to find an elderly man in gardener's clothes regarding her with curiosity. "Forgive the intrusion. I am Baxter, head gardener, or what passes for one in these neglected grounds." "Mr. Baxter," Constance offered him a smile. "I was just admiring what I could see of the rose garden. Mrs. Henshaw told me it was created by the late Viscountess." "Fine, my lady." Baxter moved to stand beside her, his weathered face taking on a wistful expression as he too peered through the gap. Lady Beatrice's pride and joy it was. Spent hours here every day, she did, tending her roses with her own hands. Said they needed love as much as water and sun. It seems a shame to allow its beauty to fall into such neglect. The words escaped before Constance could stop them. Baxter sighed. "It is, my lady. But the old Viscount ordered it locked after she passed, and the current Viscount has never countermanded that order. Some things are too painful to revisit, I suppose." Constance understood that sentiment all too well. "Yes, I suppose they are." She returned to the house, thoughtful and vaguely melancholic, the image of that locked garden lingering in her mind. That evening, unable to settle to reading or needlework, she wandered into the small study adjacent to her sitting room that she had barely explored since her arrival. The room was lined with bookshelves, most of which held the sorts of volumes one would expect in a lady's library. Novels and poetry, books of sermons, guides to household management. But one shelf caught her attention, its contents different from the rest. Scientific texts on botany and horticulture, volumes on the cultivation of roses, journals bound in leather with no titles on their spines. Constance pulled down one of the journals with careful hands and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was feminine and elegant, the date 23 years past. "Observations on the cultivation of Rosa Damascena," she read silently, being an account of their planting and care at Thornley Court. Lady Beatrice's garden journal. Constance's heart quickened as she leafed through pages filled with detailed notes, small sketches of blooms, and records of which varieties thrived in which locations. The late Viscountess had been not just a gardener, but a scholar of her craft, studying her roses with the precision of a scientist and the passion of an artist. Constance spent the rest of the evening absorbed in the journal, learning about the woman who had once occupied these rooms. Lady Beatrice emerged from the pages as someone gentle yet determined, finding joy in small beauties and comfort in the natural world. She wrote of her son Lucian with evident love, noting his 12th birthday and hoping he would one day appreciate the garden she created. The entries stopped abruptly in the autumn, a few months before Lady Beatrice's death. The final entry was brief, almost rushed. "The inflammation has worsened. Dr. Cavendish says I must keep to my bed, but how can I when the roses need deadheading? Elle is so young still. I fear for him if I should not recover. His father is not a gentle man." Constance closed the journal with trembling hands, her eyes burning with unshed tears for a woman she had never met. The Viscount had lost his mother at 12 to illness, and his father had been cruel. Then, years later, he had lost his betrothed just weeks before their wedding, also to illness. No wonder he held himself so apart. He had learned that love brought nothing but devastating loss. She sat in silence for a long time, holding the journal against her chest and thinking about the locked garden and the man who had locked his heart just as firmly. She could not heal him. He had made it clear he neither wanted nor needed her attempts at comfort or connection, but perhaps she could honor his mother's memory in her own small way. The next morning, Constance sought out Baxter in the conservatory where he was repotting seedlings. "Mr. Baxter, I have a question for you. How difficult would it be to restore Lady Beatrice's rose garden?" The old gardener looked up, surprise evident in his weathered features. "Restore it, my lady. It would be a considerable undertaking after all these years, but not impossible, if that is what you are asking." Could it be done quietly, without his lordship's knowledge, at least initially? The idea had come to her in the night, audacious and probably foolish, but she could not shake it. "I found Lady Beatrice's journals. I thought perhaps we might use them as a guide, bring the garden back to what she envisioned, as a sort of tribute to her." Baxter studied her for a long moment, something like respect dawning in his eyes. "His lordship rides every morning and keeps to his study or the village most afternoons. He has not walked the grounds in years, my lady. If we were careful, if we worked when he was otherwise occupied, it could be done without his notice." "Then let us begin." Constance felt purpose stir within her for the first time since her arrival. "I will need a key to the garden." "I can have one made, my lady," quietly. "Thank you, Mr. Baxter." Constance moved to leave, then turned back. "And Mr. Baxter, I know this is irregular. If his lordship discovers what we are doing and disapproves, I will take full responsibility. You are simply following my instructions." The gardener's expression softened. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but Lady Beatrice would have liked you, I think. She believed gardens needed tending, not abandonment. She would be glad to know someone cared enough to try." Over the following weeks, Constance threw herself into the secret restoration with an intensity that surprised her. Each morning after the Viscount departed for his ride, she would make her way to the walled garden with Baxter and whatever day labourers he could trust to discretion. They cleared decades of overgrowth, pruned back wild roses that had survived against all odds, repaired trellises and arbours, and gradually revealed the bones of Lady Beatrice's design. Constance consulted the journals constantly, trying to recreate exactly what the late Viscountess had envisioned. She ordered rose plants to replace those too damaged to save, following Lady Beatrice's notes about which varieties had thrived in which locations. She had the fountain cleaned and repaired, the stone paths relaid, the benches restored. The work was physically demanding and emotionally consuming, but it gave her something the past weeks had lacked: purpose and a sense of accomplishment. She began to understand why Lady Beatrice had loved this place. There was something deeply satisfying about coaxing beauty from neglect, about working with earth and living things to create something lovely. She took her meals in her rooms as always, saw the Viscount only on Sundays, and spent her evenings reading more of Lady Beatrice's journals or sketching plans for the garden's continued restoration. If the household staff found her behaviour odd, they said nothing. Mrs. Henshaw, in fact, seemed quietly approving when she noticed dirt under Constance's fingernails or caught sight of her slipping in through the terrace doors. It was on a Tuesday morning in late May, nearly 2 months into her marriage, that the first breach appeared in the barricade of the Viscount's indifference. Constance had just returned from the garden and was crossing the entrance hall when she heard raised voices from the library. She paused, knowing she should not eavesdrop but unable to help herself. "You cannot continue like this, Lucian." The voice was female, imperious, and unfamiliar to Constance. "It has been 7 years. Rosalind would not have wanted you to entomb yourself in grief." "You did not know Rosalind, Aunt Prudence." The Viscount's voice was cold as winter frost. "And my personal affairs are not your concern. They are when you make foolish decisions, such as this hasty marriage to some impoverished nobody. What were you thinking?" Constance felt her face flame with humiliation, even as she remained frozen in place. "I was thinking," the Viscount said with deadly calm, "that I required a wife to manage my household, and you required a reminder that you are a guest in my home, not its mistress. Mrs. Bellamy is perfectly suited to her role." "Mrs. Bellamy?" the woman scoffed. "Have you even spoken to the poor child beyond your initial instructions? She wanders the grounds like a ghost, takes her meals alone, might as well not exist for all the attention you pay her." "That is precisely the arrangement we agreed upon. I fail to see how it concerns you. It concerns me because I loved your mother, and she would be ashamed to see you treating any woman this way, let alone your own wife." A terrible silence followed this statement. Then the Viscount spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "Do not presume to speak for my mother. You who visited her twice in the last year of her life, who were too occupied with your London social life to attend her deathbed. You have no right to invoke her memory. Lucian, this conversation is over. I will have your carriage brought around. I am sure you are eager to return to London." Constance fled before she could hear more, her heart pounding as she hurried up the stairs to the safety of her apartments. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to process what she had heard. The Viscount had defended her in his way, not warmly perhaps, but he had refused to allow his aunt to disparage her. And he had revealed something else. His mother's death had been attended by grief and abandonment by family. No wonder he was so closed off, so determined to rely on no one. She was still standing there when a knock came at the door. Constance opened it to find Mrs. Henshaw, her expression troubled. "My lady, his lordship requests your presence in the drawing-room. Lady Prudence Casteres, his aunt, is departing and wishes to pay her respects." Constance's first instinct was to refuse, to claim illness or some other excuse. But she had promised herself she would fulfill every obligation expected of her position. "Of course, please tell his lordship I will be down directly." She changed quickly into a more formal morning dress, checked her hair in the mirror, and descended the stairs with as much dignity as she could muster. The drawing-room door stood open. Inside she found the Viscount standing by the fireplace, his expression carved from granite, while an elegantly dressed woman of perhaps 50 years regarded him with evident frustration. "Ah," the woman said as Constance entered. "The mysterious Mrs. Bellamy. Come in, child, let me look at you." Constance advanced into the room, very conscious of the Viscount's gaze upon her. "Lady Prudence, it is a pleasure to meet you." "Is it?" Lady Prudence's assessment was frank and not particularly kind. "You are younger than I expected, and quite plain, though I suppose that hardly matters given the nature of the arrangement." "Aunt Prudence," the Viscount's voice cracked like a whip, "you will speak to my wife with respect, or you will leave this house immediately." Constance felt something shift inside her at those words, "my wife," spoken with such unexpected intensity. She lifted her chin and met Lady Prudence's gaze directly. "I am aware that I am not a great beauty, my lady, but I assure you I am perfectly capable of managing Thornley Court and fulfilling the duties expected of a Viscountess." Something flickered in Lady Prudence's eyes. Reassessment, perhaps. A serviceable backbone, then. That is a start. She gathered her reticule and gloves. "I shall leave you to your peculiar arrangement, nephew, though I maintain it is unhealthy for both of you." The Viscount escorted his aunt to her carriage without another word. Constance remained in the drawing-room, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline of the confrontation faded. She heard the carriage depart, heard the Viscount's footsteps return to the entrance hall, and braced herself for him to simply walk past the drawing-room without acknowledgement. Instead, he appeared in the doorway. They regarded each other in silence for a long moment. "Thank you," Constance said finally, "for defending me to your aunt. It was nothing." But his expression had softened slightly from its usual coldness. "Lady Prudence is a difficult woman. She was my father's sister and shared many of his less pleasant qualities." "She mentioned your mother." The words escaped before Constance could stop them. "She said she would be ashamed of how you treat me." The softness vanished instantly, replaced by a frost so severe that Constance wished she could recall the words. "My aunt knows nothing of my mother or what she would have wanted. I will thank you not to give her words any credence." "Of course, my lord. Forgive me." Constance dropped a small curtsy, preparing to withdraw to her rooms and the safety of solitude. "Mrs. Bellamy," the Viscount's voice stopped her at the door. "I have noticed that you walk the grounds frequently. I trust you are finding ways to occupy yourself." It was perhaps the first personal question he had asked her since their wedding day. Constance turned back, searching his face for any hint of genuine interest, but found only polite inquiry. "I am, my lord. The gardens have a certain melancholy beauty." "Melancholy?" he repeated, as though tasting the word. "Yes, I suppose they do." He paused, seemed about to say something more, then simply nodded. "Good day, Mrs. Bellamy." "Good day, my lord." Constance escaped to her rooms and did not emerge again until after the dinner hour had passed. But she found herself thinking about that brief exchange, about the way he had defended her and the momentary softening in his expression. It meant nothing, she told herself firmly. He was simply being civil, performing the bare minimum required by their situation. Yet when she returned to the walled garden the next morning, she worked with renewed energy, driven by something she could not quite name. The garden was taking shape beautifully now, the roses she had planted beginning to bud, the paths clear and inviting, the fountain once again splashing gently in the center. Another few weeks and it would be a showplace, a worthy tribute to Lady Beatrice's vision. She was on her knees weeding around a particularly recalcitrant climbing rose when Baxter approached with a puzzled expression. "My lady, something odd has occurred. Someone has been leaving things for you in the garden." Constance sat back on her heels. "Leaving things? What sort of things?" "Come see for yourself, my lady." He led her to a stone bench near the fountain where she had left her bonnet and gloves. Beside them lay a leather-bound volume she had not placed there. Constance picked it up with soil-stained fingers and opened the cover. A treatise on the cultivation of old garden roses, published just 2 years prior. On the flyleaf, in an elegant masculine hand, was written simply, "For the gardener." Who could have left this? Constance looked around as though the mysterious benefactor might still be lurking among the roses. Baxter shrugged, but his eyes held a knowing gleam. "Cannot say, my lady, but someone seems to appreciate your efforts." Over the following weeks, other small gifts appeared. A pair of gardening gloves in soft leather that fit her hands perfectly, a box of bulbs for autumn planting, a watercolor painting of roses in full bloom. Always unsigned, always left where Constance would find them during her morning work in the garden. She knew, of course, who the giver must be. The Viscount had access to the house and grounds, and the gifts bore the marks of someone with both means and knowledge of horticulture. But why? What did it mean that he would leave these tokens while maintaining his cold distance in every other aspect of their interaction? It was a tiny, fragile bridge being built, and she knew a single careless word could send it tumbling into the chasm of their established formality. When she tried to thank him obliquely at Sunday service, mentioning how much she appreciated a certain book on roses she had recently acquired, he simply nodded politely and changed the subject. The mystery remained unsolved. The gifts continued to appear, and Constance found herself looking forward to each discovery with an anticipation she knew was dangerous. The season began in earnest, and with it came expectations of the Viscount's presence in London. He departed Thornley Court in early June for what Mrs. Henshaw indicated would be several weeks in town. Constance remained behind, as had been tacitly agreed, continuing her work in the garden and her management of the household. She told herself his absence made no difference, that she was accustomed to his lack of presence in her daily life. But the house felt emptier without him, the silent meals more lonely, the evenings longer and more melancholic. She had grown used to the possibility of glimpsing him in the corridors, to the awareness that he was somewhere within the walls, even if they rarely spoke. The garden reached full bloom while he was away. Constance walked among the roses in the soft summer twilight and wished foolishly that he could see what had been accomplished. Lady Beatrice's vision had been restored, made real again through patience and care. The garden lived and breathed and perfumed the air with sweetness, a monument to a woman whose love had outlasted even death. The Viscount returned on a Friday in late June, and Constance heard of his arrival only through the servants' grapevine. She kept to her rooms that evening, expecting no change in their usual pattern. So it came as a considerable surprise when a knock came at her sitting-room door near 9 o'clock. She opened it to find the Viscount standing in the corridor, still in his travel clothes, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Bellamy, forgive the intrusion. Might I have a word?" "Of course, my lord." Constance stepped back to allow him entry, her heart beginning to race at this unprecedented visit to her private rooms. "I trust your journey was pleasant?" "Tolerable." He moved to the window but did not sit, his gaze fixed on the darkening gardens below. "I understand from Mrs. Henshaw that you have been managing the household with great competence in my absence." "I have endeavored to do so, my lord." "She also mentioned that you have been spending considerable time in the gardens. I confess, I had not realized you had such an interest in horticulture." Constance's breath caught. This was the closest he had come to acknowledging the mysterious gifts. "I find it peaceful work, my lord, and I have been reading extensively on the subject." "Indeed." He turned from the window to face her, and in the lamplight she saw something in his expression she had never seen before. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the ghost of some deeper emotion. "Mrs. Bellamy, I wonder if you might accompany me for a brief walk. There is something I would like to show you." "Now, my lord, it is nearly dark. Nevertheless, if you would indulge me." It was not quite a request, but neither was it a command. Constance found herself nodding, reaching for a shawl against the evening chill. He led her down the stairs and out through the terrace doors, along paths she had walked dozens of times in her secret visits to the walled garden. Her pulse quickened as she realized where he was taking her. Had he discovered what she had done? Was she about to be reprimanded for overstepping her bounds? They reached the arched wooden door, and the Viscount produced a key from his pocket. The same key, Constance realized, that Baxter had given her months ago. He had known all along. Of course he had. The door swung open, and they stepped into the garden as twilight gave way to true darkness. But lanterns had been lit along the paths, dozens of them, transforming the space into something from a fairy story. Roses glowed in the soft light, their colors muted, but their beauty undimmed, and the fountain's splash seemed louder in the evening quiet. "You did this," the Viscount said quietly, and it was not a question. "All of this. You brought my mother's garden back to life." Constance swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. "I found her journals in the library. I thought it seemed a shame to let all her work be forgotten. I hope you are not angry that I presumed—" "Angry?" He turned to look at her, and in the lantern light his eyes held an expression she could not interpret. "Mrs. Bellamy, I am many things, but angry is not among them." They walked in silence along the paths, the Viscount occasionally pausing to examine a particular rose or touch a restored trellis. Constance waited, barely breathing, for him to explain this sudden shift in their dynamic. "I was 12 when my mother died," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "Scarlet fever took her in less than a week. My father blamed me, said if I had not brought the illness into the house from school, she would have lived. He had this garden locked the day after her funeral and forbade anyone to speak her name in his presence." "That is monstrously cruel," Constance whispered. "Yes." He stopped beside the fountain, trailing his fingers through the water. "I believed him for years, believed I had killed her with my carelessness. It was not until much later that I learned several children at school had fallen ill at the same time, that scarlet fever was rampant that season, that there was nothing I could have done to prevent it. Children should not bear such burdens." Constance moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice despite her better judgment. "No. They should not." He looked up at the night sky visible beyond the garden walls. "I met Rosalind when I was 27. She was gentle and kind, and she made me believe I could have something like happiness. We were to be married in July of 1809. She contracted typhoid fever while visiting friends in Bath 3 weeks before the wedding. I held her hand as she died, and swore I would never allow myself to care for anyone that deeply again." Understanding crashed over Constance like a wave. Every cold word, every distant gesture, every wall he had erected between them, all of it made terrible sense now. He had loved and lost twice, both times to illness, both times leaving him devastated. No wonder he refused to risk his heart again. "So, when my brother came to you with his proposal," she said slowly, "you saw an opportunity to fulfill your obligations without risking emotional attachment." "Yes." He met her eyes directly. "I was honest with you from the beginning about what I could offer. I will not apologize for that honesty." "I do not ask you to, my lord." Constance wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, against a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "You have kept the terms of our arrangement scrupulously. I have no complaint. And yet—" He moved closer, close enough that she could see the lines care and grief had carved into his face. "Yet I find myself in an unexpected position, Mrs. Bellamy. I have been watching you these months, seeing how you have brought life back to this house, to the gardens my mother loved, the books, the gloves, the small gifts I left you. You did leave them. The confirmation sent warmth spreading through Constance's chest. I did. I wanted to acknowledge your efforts without having to speak of them directly. Cowardly, perhaps. He smiled, a brief, self-mocking expression. I told myself I was simply being courteous to the woman managing my household. But watching you restore my mother's garden, reading her journals to understand what she had envisioned, working with your own hands in the soil... He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. Constance waited, afraid to breathe, afraid to break whatever spell had brought them to this moment of honesty. I find that I have come to care for you, he said at last, the words emerging as though torn from some deep place within him. Not as I cared for Rosalind. Differently, perhaps more deeply, because you are so entirely yourself, requiring nothing from me but asking for courtesy. You are remarkable, Constance Millicent Bellamy, and I have been stubbornly and profoundly foolish. Constance felt tears spring to her eyes at the sound of her full name on his lips, spoken with such unexpected tenderness. You have not been a fool, my lord. You have been protecting yourself from further pain. That is only human. Lucian. He reached out tentatively, as though unsure of his right to touch her, and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. My name is Lucian, and I am tired of protecting myself if it means remaining alone in this house that you have brought back to life. What are you saying? Constance hardly dared to hope, after months of resignation to loneliness. I am saying that I would like to begin again if you will permit it. Not as strangers bound by contract, but as two people who might learn to build something real together. I cannot promise you the grand passion of a novel. I am too damaged, too practiced at distance to transform overnight. But I can promise you honesty, respect, and the genuine attempt to be more than I have been. Constance looked up at this complicated man who had been wounded so profoundly by loss that he had armored himself against all connection. She thought of the past months, of her lonely dinners and quiet heartbreak, of the garden she had restored as much for herself as for his mother's memory. She thought of the uncertain future that stretched before them, of all the reasons she should protect her own heart as carefully as he had protected his. She knew this choice was not logical, but the fear in his eyes, the terror of being left alone again, convinced her. He needed a shield against the ghost of Rosalind, and only she could stand in that gap. I accept, she heard herself say, on one condition. Name it. You must truly try, Lucian. Not simply go through the motions or make promises you cannot keep. I will not settle for an imitation of affection or the cold remnants of what you cannot give. If we do this, we do it with intention and honest effort. I understand, he confirmed, his grip tightening. And I promise you, Constance, I will try. I may stumble. I may retreat into old habits when fear overtakes me. But I will try. They stood in the garden Constance had restored, surrounded by roses and lantern light, and the ghosts of old griefs. And something fragile and precious took root between them, the first green shoot of hope pushing through winter soil toward the sun. Shall we walk? Lucian offered his arm, and Constance took it, feeling the solid strength of him beside her for the first time. They walked until the lanterns began to gutter and true night settled over Thornley Court. They spoke of matters of little import, relearning each other as people rather than actors, playing roles in a marriage of convenience. And when Lucian finally escorted Constance back to her apartments, he paused at the door with an expression of mingled hope and uncertainty. Would you join me for dinner tomorrow evening? He asked. In the dining room, not in solitude. I would like that very much, Constance replied. He lifted her hand to his lips, in a gesture both courtly and achingly tender. Until tomorrow, then. Sleep well, Constance. She watched him walk away down the corridor, then closed her door and leaned against it with a smile she could not suppress. The future remained uncertain, the path forward unclear, but for the first time since her wedding day, Constance felt hope stirring in her heart. The healing was not instantaneous. Lucian had been honest in that assessment. But slowly, gradually, cracks appeared in the walls he had built around himself. They began dining together in the evenings, Lucian joining her in the smaller family dining room, where conversation could flow more easily than across the vast expanse of the formal table. At first their discussions were stilted, both of them feeling their way through unfamiliar territory. But as days passed, the conversations grew longer and more natural. They discovered shared interests in books and music, debated politics with surprising passion, and even laughed together over small absurdities. Lucian asked to read his mother's garden journals, and Constance found him one afternoon in the library, with the volumes spread before him, tears tracking down his face as he read Lady Beatrice's loving descriptions of her young son. She sat beside him without speaking, offering only her presence, and when he reached for her hand, she gave it without hesitation. "She loved you very much," Constance said softly when he finally closed the journals. "Every page is full of it." "I had forgotten," Lucian replied, his voice rough with emotion. "My father never spoke of her, forbade anyone else to mention her. I had forgotten how much she loved the gardens, how she would take me with her and teach me the names of every flower. I had forgotten everything except the loss. You can remember now, the garden is here. Her words are here. She is not lost, Lucian, just waiting to be found again." He pulled Constance into an embrace then, holding her with a desperation that spoke of years of suppressed sorrow. She wrapped her arms around him and let him cling to her, offering what comfort she could to a man learning to feel again after so long in the cold. The household noticed the changes, of course. Mrs. Henshaw smiled more often, and Greaves the butler seemed to walk with a lighter step. The maids whispered among themselves about his lordship's improved mood and how he looked at her ladyship with something approaching warmth. Even Baxter commented on the fine weather and how good it was to see the gardens properly appreciated at last. July brought heat and the full glory of the restored rose garden. Lucian took to walking there in the evenings, sometimes alone but increasingly with Constance at his side. They would stroll among the blooms his mother had planned, and he would tell her stories about growing up at Thornley Court, about the mother he had lost and was now reclaiming from memory. One evening, as they sat together on a bench near the fountain, Lucian turned to Constance with an expression of such earnest vulnerability that her breath caught. "I want you to know," he said, "that what I feel for you now is not simply gratitude for restoring this garden or making my house more livable. You have become important to me, Constance, more important than I ever intended to allow. And that frightens you." It was not a question. "Terrifies me," he admitted. "I lie awake at night cataloguing all the ways I could lose you. Illness, accident, 1,000 random cruelties that fate might inflict. I know it is irrational, that I cannot protect against every possibility, but the fear remains." Constance took his hand between both of hers. "I cannot promise I will never fall ill or that tragedy will not strike. No one can make such promises. But I can promise you this, Lucian, I am here now, alive and well, and choosing to build this life with you. We can live in fear of loss, or we can live fully in each moment we are granted. I prefer the latter. I have been stubbornly and profoundly foolish. Not wiser, simply more willing to take the risk." She smiled at him, this damaged man who was working so hard to overcome years of self-imposed isolation. "Love always requires risk, Lucian, but I believe the reward outweighs the danger." He searched her face for a long moment. "You love me." "I am beginning to, yes." Constance saw no reason to dissemble. "I did not expect to. I had resigned myself to a marriage of convenience and nothing more. But you have surprised me at every turn, and I find that my heart has its own ideas about what is practical. I do not deserve you." Lucian raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "But I am selfish enough to keep you anyway." "Good." Constance leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of roses and summer twilight. "Because I have no intention of going anywhere." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the garden, and Constance thought about how far they had come from that terrible first day when Lucian had declared she would never be his true wife. She was not that yet, perhaps, but they were building towards something real and precious, and that was enough. August arrived with a heat wave that drove even the most stalwart indoors during the afternoon hours. Constance and Lucian adapted by rising early to walk before the day grew too warm, taking their breakfast together in the morning room and spending the hottest hours in the library where the thick walls kept the temperature bearable. It was during one such afternoon that disaster struck. Lucien had gone to London the previous week on business, returning with what he assured Constance was merely travel fatigue. But by the second day after his return, he was fevered and weak, barely able to rise from his bed. Dr. Waverley came from the village and diagnosed typhoid fever with grim certainty. "We must isolate his lordship immediately," he instructed Mrs. Henshaw. "The illness is highly contagious. No one should attend him except trained staff, and even they should take every precaution." Constance, listening from the corridor outside Lucien's rooms, felt ice slide down her spine. Typhoid was the same illness that had taken Rosalind, the same illness that terrified Lucien more than any other affliction, because it had stolen his betrothed mere weeks before their wedding. "I will attend him," she heard herself say, stepping into the doorway. Dr. Waverley turned to her with obvious alarm. "My lady, I must strongly advise against it. The risk of contagion, I understand the risk." Constance moved past him into the bedroom, where Lucien lay grey-faced and shivering despite the heat. "But I am his wife, and I will not leave him to face this alone." "Constance, no," he insisted, his voice weak but urgent. "You cannot. If you should fall ill, if I should lose you, I cannot bear it." "You will not lose me." She came to kneel beside the bed, taking his burning hand in hers. "I am stronger than I look, and I have no intention of succumbing to fever. But you need someone with you, Lucien, and it will be me. Please." His fingers tightened around hers with what strength he could muster. "Please, I cannot bear it. Rosalind died like this, burning with fever, and I could do nothing but watch. I cannot watch you die as well." "Then you will have to recover quickly, so I do not have the opportunity." Constance kept her voice light, despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Dr. Waverley, what must be done?" Over the physician's protests and Lucien's weakening objections, Constance established herself in the dressing room, adjacent to his bedchamber. She sent Mrs. Henshaw away with instructions to keep the rest of the staff clear of the wing and to have fresh water and clean linens sent up every few hours. Then she settled in to fight for her husband's life. The next 3 days existed in a haze of fever and fear. Lucien's temperature soared, and he fell into delirium, calling out for his mother, for Rosalind, for people Constance did not know. She bathed his burning skin with cool water, forced him to drink when he was lucid enough to swallow, changed his sweat-soaked sheets, and remained by his side through every terrible hour. On the second night, his fever spiked dangerously high. Dr. Waverley warned that the next few hours would be critical, and asked again if Constance would not prefer to wait elsewhere. She refused, maintaining her vigil even as Lucien thrashed and mumbled, lost in the landscapes of his fevered mind. "Mother, forgive me," he whispered at one point, his eyes open but seeing nothing of the present. "I did not mean to bring the sickness home. I did not know." "You are forgiven," Constance said softly, bathing his face with a cool cloth. "You were a child, Lucien. It was never your fault." "Rosalind," tears leaked from his closed eyes. "Rosalind, do not leave me. Please do not leave me alone again. I am here." Constance took his hand, gripping it tightly. "I am here, Lucien, and I am not leaving. Do you hear me? I am not leaving." Toward dawn on the third day, the fever finally broke. Lucien woke clear-eyed for the first time since falling ill, his gaze focusing on Constance's face with evident confusion. She was slumped in a chair beside the bed, exhausted beyond measure but still awake, still watching. "Constance?" His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "You are still here. Where else would I be?" She leaned forward to feel his forehead, relief flooding through her at the cooler temperature. "The fever has broken, thank God. You should not have stayed. The risk was mine to take." Constance silenced him with a finger to his lips. "And I am perfectly well, as you can see. Now drink this water and stop arguing with me. You are still far too weak for such exertions." He drank, then caught her hand as she tried to draw back. "You could have died. You could have contracted the fever and died, and it would have destroyed me, Constance. Do you understand? It would have destroyed me entirely." "Then you understand," she said gently, "why I had to stay. Why I could not leave you to face this alone, risking that you might die believing yourself abandoned. I love you, Lucien. How could I do anything else? He pulled her down to him with surprising strength for someone so recently recovered, and kissed her with a desperate tenderness that spoke of fear and relief, and the fragile hope of surviving the unsurvivable. When they finally broke apart, both were crying. "I love you," Lucian said, the words emerging as though they had been locked away for years. "God help me. I love you so much it terrifies me. I fell in love with you watching you restore my mother's garden, but I was too cowardly to admit it even to myself. I told myself you were simply a competent household manager, that my interest was merely appreciation for good work. But I was lying, Constance. I have loved you for months." "I know," she smiled through her tears. "I have known for some time. You are not as subtle as you think, leaving me books and gardening gloves. I wanted to give you things without having to acknowledge why I wanted to. Pathetic, really. Not pathetic, afraid. But you do not need to be afraid anymore, Lucian. I am here. I choose to be here, with all the risks that entails." He held her close, and Constance felt the last walls between them crumble. They had been through the fire and emerged together on the other side, and nothing would ever again have the power to separate them. The recovery was slow but steady. Lucian regained his strength over the following weeks, and Constance nursed him with a tenderness that became as natural as breathing. They talked for hours as he convalesced, sharing stories and dreams, learning each other with an intimacy that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with the meeting of two souls. When Lucian was finally strong enough to walk again, his first destination was the rose garden. Constance accompanied him, supporting his still weak steps, and they stood together among the blooms as summer faded toward autumn. "I want to make a request," Lucian said, his arm around Constance's waist for support and comfort both. "When we die, whenever that may be, I want us to be buried here in this garden, together as we should be." That is a rather morbid thought for such a beautiful day. But Constance understood the impulse behind it, the need to claim their future even in death. "Perhaps, but I have spent too many years fearing loss and not enough time celebrating what I have. I have you, Constance. I have this garden my mother loved and you restored. I have a life worth living again, and I want to ensure that nothing separates us, not even death." "Then we shall be buried here," Constance agreed, "among the roses, side by side, but not for many, many years yet, if you please. We have too much living still to do." "Agreed." He kissed her temple, a gesture that had become habitual and dear. "Starting with making this marriage real in every sense, I know we have not yet, that I kept you at arm's length and denied us both the comfort of true intimacy. But if you are willing, Constance, I would very much like for you to become my wife in truth." Constance turned in his arms to face him fully. "Are you asking my permission, Lucian?" "I am asking if you are ready. If your heart is ready. I will not rush you or pressure you. I want this to be right, to be what we both desire." "Then yes." She reached up to cup his face in her hands. "Yes, I am ready. I have been ready for some time. I want to be your wife in every way that matters." That night, Lucian came to Constance's apartments for the first time since their wedding, but everything was different now. He came as a man who loved and was loved in return, who had chosen vulnerability over protection and found it the better choice. And when he took Constance to bed, it was with a tenderness and passion that erased every lonely night that had preceded it. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the lamplight, Lucian gently stroked Constance's bare shoulder and spoke the words she had never thought to hear. "You are my true wife," he said softly. "In every way that matters, in every way I swore you would never be. You are my partner, my love, my reason for believing happiness is possible. I am sorry it took me so long to admit it." "You needed time to heal," Constance replied, her head resting over his heart. "We both did. But we found our way to each other in the end, and that is what matters. Promise me something, Constance. Anything. Promise me that if I begin to retreat into old habits, if fear makes me cold again, you will call me back. Remind me that love is worth the risk." "I promise." She lifted her head to kiss him. "And you must promise me the same. We will call each other back when we stray, We will choose love over fear every day for the rest of our lives. I promise." They sealed the vow with kisses and the slow rediscovery of each other's bodies, and when dawn finally broke over Thornley Court, Constance felt more at peace than she had since her mother's death. She had found a home in this house of ghosts and grief, had found love where she least expected it, and had helped heal a man who had believed himself beyond healing. The months that followed brought a deepening of their connection and a gradual dissipation of Lucian's remaining frosty reserve. They moved Constance's belongings into the master suite, no longer maintaining the pretense of separate lives. They entertained for the first time in 8 years, hosting a small dinner party for the local gentry that went surprisingly well, despite Lucian's initial nervousness. They rode together through the countryside, visited the tenants, and made plans for improvements to the estate. Lucian taught Constance to appreciate fine wines, and she taught him to find joy in small domestic pleasures he had long dismissed. They were building a life together, deliberately and with open eyes, and it was richer than either could have imagined. In late December, Constance began to experience morning sickness. By January, Dr. Waverley confirmed what she had already suspected. She was with child. When she told Lucian the news, she saw fear flash across his face before he mastered it, pulling her into an embrace that trembled with barely suppressed emotion. "I am terrified," he admitted that night as they lay in bed. "I am terrified of losing you to childbirth, of something going wrong, of being left alone with a child to raise as my father raised me. I know it is irrational, but I cannot help it." "It is not irrational." Constance took his hand and placed it on her still flat belly. "Childbirth carries risks, but we will hire the best physicians, take every precaution, and I will be as careful as possible. And Lucian, you are not your father. You could never be your father. You have spent these months learning to love again. You will not suddenly forget how when our child arrives. How can you be so certain? Because I know you. I have seen you at your worst and your best, and I know the man you are. Our child will be loved, Lucian, fiercely and completely loved by both of us." He held her close through the night, and in the morning Constance woke to find him already dressed and seated at her writing desk, penning a letter. "I am writing to London for recommendations of the finest physicians," he explained when she stirred, "and I want to have the nursery completely refurbished. My mother's old nursery, I thought. Make it a place of warmth and light." "That sounds perfect." Constance smiled at this evidence of his determination to overcome fear through action. "Shall we look at it together after breakfast?" The months of Constance's pregnancy passed with surprising tranquility. Lucian remained attentive but strove to control his anxiety, channeling it into preparation and planning rather than obsessive worry. He interviewed physicians personally, refusing to settle for anyone who did not meet his exacting standards. He had the nursery completely renovated and stood with Constance for hours as she selected fabrics and furnishings, seeking her opinion on every detail. As her time drew near, Constance could see the fear building in him again, despite his best efforts to conceal it. She would wake in the night to find him awake beside her, his hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, his expression troubled in the moonlight. "Talk to me," she would say, and he would pour out his terrors. That she would die as his mother had died, that the child would be born sickly or damaged, that he would fail them both, prove himself as inadequate a father as his own had been. And Constance would listen and reassure and remind him that love was stronger than fear. The labor began on a warm June evening, exactly 9 months after the night they had truly become husband and wife. Dr. Cavendish arrived within the hour, along with a midwife from the village and Dr. Waverley as additional support. Lucian wanted to remain with Constance, but the physicians firmly excluded him from the birthing room despite his protests. He paced the corridor outside for 12 hours while Constance labored, ignoring all attempts to convince him to rest elsewhere. Mrs. Henshaw brought him food he did not eat, and Greaves offered brandy he refused. He simply walked back and forth, occasionally pausing at the door to listen to sounds he could not interpret, his face growing more haggard with each passing hour. When the baby finally arrived near dawn, when the midwife opened the door with a broad smile to announce a healthy daughter, Lucian pushed past her without ceremony to get to his wife. Constance lay pale and exhausted against the pillows, but she was smiling, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in soft white linen. "Lucian," her voice was hoarse but warm, "come meet our daughter." He approached the bed as though in a dream, his eyes fixed on the small face visible within the blankets. "A daughter," he repeated wonderingly. "We have a daughter." "We do." Constance shifted to make room for him beside her. "A very loud daughter who made her arrival known to the entire household, I suspect, but healthy, perfect. Would you like to hold her?" Lucian took the baby with trembling hands, cradling her against his chest as though she were made of spun glass. The infant blinked up at him with unfocused eyes, and he felt something crack open in his chest, some final barrier between himself and complete vulnerability. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your father, and I promise you, I will do better than mine did. I will love you and your mother with everything I have, and I will not let fear make me cruel. You will know you are wanted, treasured, cherished every day of your life." Constance watched as Lucian made his vows to their daughter, and she knew beyond doubt that their child would grow up in a house filled with love rather than coldness, that the cycle of pain and isolation had been broken. "What shall we name her?" Lucian asked, still gazing at the baby with wonder. "I thought perhaps Beatrice," Constance suggested softly. "After your mother, if that would not be too painful." Lucian looked up at her with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Beatrice, yes, she would have loved that. She would have loved you." He leaned over carefully to kiss Constance, baby Beatrice held safe between them. "Thank you. For her. For everything. For saving me from the prison of my own making." "We saved each other," Constance corrected. "And now we will raise our daughter together, in love and joy and the garden her grandmother created." Over the following years, Thornley Court transformed from a house of ghosts into a home filled with life and laughter. Beatrice grew into a bright, curious child who loved the rose garden as much as her grandmother had. Constance gave birth to a son, James, 2 years later, and the nursery that had been cold and empty for so long rang with children's voices. Lucian proved himself everything he had promised to be: an attentive father, a loving husband, a man who had learned to embrace life rather than hide from it. He still had difficult days, moments when old fears reasserted themselves, but Constance was always there to call him back, to remind him that love was worth the risk. They expanded the gardens, adding new sections and features, while maintaining the heart of Lady Beatrice's original design. The rose garden became a place where they gathered as a family on summer evenings, where Beatrice and James played, while their parents sat together and watched the sun set over the flowers. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucian led Constance to the garden at twilight, just as he had done years before when he first revealed his feelings. The children were with Mrs. Henshaw. The evening was soft and warm, and roses perfumed the air with their familiar sweetness. "Do you remember," Lucian said as they walked, "what I told you on our wedding day? That you would never be my true wife." "I remember." Constance smiled at the memory, so painful then, but merely poignant now. "You were quite emphatic about it." "I was a fool." He stopped beside the fountain, drawing her into his arms. "You have been my true wife from the moment you began restoring this garden, though I was too blind to see it. You have been my partner, my love, my anchor in storm. You have given me children I adore and a life I never thought to have. And I want you to know, Constance, that I thank God every day that your brother sold you to the highest bidder, and that I was arrogant enough to believe I could keep my heart locked away. A singular perspective, my lord, though perhaps I shall allow it to pass just this once." But Constance laughed, understanding what he meant. "Though I suppose I am grateful too. If Edmund had not been desperate, and you had not been determined to remain alone, we would never have found each other. And built something extraordinary from the ashes of grief and loneliness." Lucian kissed her with the familiarity of long intimacy. "I love you, Constance Millicent Bellamy. I am the most fortunate man in England, for I was given 2 lives, and you saved the second. I love you too, Lucian, even when you are being dramatic and overly sentimental in the rose garden." She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Shall we go in? The children will want their goodnight kisses." "In a moment." He held her closer, breathing in the scent of roses and the warmth of the woman who had saved him. Just one more moment here, where it all began. They stood together as darkness claimed the garden, two people who had found their way to love through pain and persistence. And when they finally walked back to the house hand in hand, it was to a home filled with light and laughter, where the ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, and the future stretched bright and promising before them. The rose garden continued to bloom year after year, a living testament to the power of love to restore what grief had tried to destroy. And when visitors to Thornley Court asked about its beauty, Constance would smile and tell them it was tended by two people who understood that the most magnificent blooms grew from the richest soil, and that sometimes the richest soil was made from the ashes of heartbreak, transformed by the persistent care of those who refused to give up on growth. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, resilience, and hope.